It's fall in the Michigan village of Wyman, and James O. Scotford has an incredible announcement to make. A crowd of locals listen, too, as the jubilant man spills his secret. There, in the earth beneath their feet, he has uncovered a cache of ancient relics. These perhaps date back thousands of years. And in this way, a modern legend is born, although Scotford isn't telling everything he knows. A series of ancient relics unearthed in Michigan concealed one of history's greatest frauds. At the time of Scotford's find, the United States was very much still a country divided. Tensions between the indigenous population and the U.S. Army were at an all-time high, and many had turned to archaeology as a way to make sense of their disjointed past. What Scotford seemed to be offering, then, was much-needed answers, but was there more to his relics than met the eye? For years, Scotford and his associate Daniel Soper continued to pull historic artifacts from the Michigan soil. To some, they were a link to the mysterious mound builders, members of advanced ancient civilizations that once thrived in North America. But to others, they were something a little more suspect. So, where did these artifacts come from? Were they, as many believed, evidence of a sophisticated pre-Columbian culture now vanished from the earth? Well, as experts studied the objects in earnest, the entire story began to fall apart. And even today, the Michigan relics are remembered as one of the most audacious frauds of all time. 14 years before Scotford first announced his historic discovery, the U.S. had been shaken by the Battle of the Little Bighorn. For decades, American settlers had been at odds with the indigenous people, constantly battling for land and power across the Western territories. But what happened on the Crow Indian Reservation turned the tide of the conflict. In the Little Bighorn Valley, members of the Lakota, Arapaho, and Cheyenne tribes squared up against Lieutenant Colonel George Custer and his hundreds of men. But while the Native Americans ultimately emerged victorious, their glory was to be short-lived. As the settlers mourned their bloody defeat, their belief that the natives were savage and violent only strengthened. And before long, the U.S. Army wrought a terrible revenge. Against this backdrop of war, there were many who sought to learn more about the indigenous people of America. And looking around them, they saw numerous earthen mounds, clearly evidence that a civilization of great age and complexity had once existed there. However, rather than credit Native Americans for these achievements, they searched elsewhere for an explanation. Of course, today we know that these mounds were built by various pre-Columbian cultures across North America. And sadly, the reason why the indigenous people of the 19th century may have seemed incapable of such a feat is because the fighting had hit them hard. Disease had, too. Back then, archaeologists credited everyone from the Vikings to the Welsh with creating the impressive structures. As stories about these mythical mound builders began to spread, they sparked an interest in the history of North America before the settlers arrived. But rather than working out the truth, which painted a fairly grim picture of the post-colonial U.S. people, came up with tales of mysterious, long-lost civilizations. All the while, the battles raged on. By October 1890, the situation between the settlers and the indigenous people was still dangerously volatile. Just 2 months later, those tensions would erupt in bloodshed as the U.S. Army slaughtered almost 300 Lakota at the Wounded Knee Massacre. Over in Michigan, though, a new American history was emerging. In late 1890, Scotford had stunned the community of Wyman with his unexpected announcement. While busy digging nearby, he claimed he had stumbled upon a collection of pottery artifacts. And the best bit? They appeared to be very old indeed. Unfortunately, reports vary as to exactly what Scotford unearthed. But it's believed that the collection included at least one clay vessel, covered in characters that appeared to be hieroglyphic in origin. Even at the time, this visual language was commonly associated with ancient cultures, and its appearance in Michigan must have caused a stir. When Scotford discovered additional artifacts in the months that followed, people really began to take notice. And before long, local treasure hunters became keen to uncover more of the strange objects for themselves. They teamed up with Scotford to dig across the village and beyond, searching for anything hidden beneath the ground. According to reports, one would-be archaeologist was so keen that he excavated too far into the earth. That eventually caused a fatal cave-in. Some of the amateurs were more successful, retrieving mysterious artifacts of their own. But none, it seems, were as prolific as Scotford, who quickly amassed an impressive collection. The artifacts were largely unearthed within a 1.5-mile radius of Wyman itself, although similar pieces allegedly turned up in other locations across Michigan. Buried at a depth of between 1.5 and 4 feet, these objects certainly appeared to have long been hidden in the dirt. But what was the real story? There was certainly a lot to investigate. Crafted from slate and copper as well as clay, the relics included amulets, pipes, coins, tablets, and caskets, as well as weapons such as daggers and axiods. Interestingly, the vast majority were emblazoned with the same cuneiform symbol, sometimes referred to as a tribal mark. Some items, meanwhile, were inscribed with hieroglyphics and strange markings in a language that scholars did not recognize. But not all of the artifacts were difficult to decipher. A few depicted familiar tales from the Bible, such as the Garden of Eden and the Great Flood. In short, these relics suggested an alternative history of North America. It seemed there had been an early population with links to the Near East. And even at the time, respectable members of society spoke out in support of the artifact's authenticity. In one pamphlet, avid collector M.E. Cornell wrote that some of the objects had been found with tree roots growing through them, implying that they were very old indeed. According to Cornell, several folks also watched Scotford pull the relics from the ground. On some occasions, influential people were even invited to pluck out the artifacts themselves. But despite all the evidence to the contrary, there were some who doubted that the enigmatic finds were ancient in origin. In June 1891, for example, Alfred Emerson, a professor at Illinois' Lake Forest College, traveled to Wyman. He wanted to take a look at the relics for himself, and he was far from impressed by what he saw. According to a paper published by the American Anthropological Association in 1908, he declared the artifacts humbugs of the first water. And that wasn't all. The following year, two professors from the University of Michigan and the University of Pennsylvania studied the inscriptions found on Scotford's relics. Soon, they too had uncovered several issues with the allegedly ancient artifacts. But even with the criticism mounting up, Wyman's strange new industry continued to thrive. In fact, things were getting so hectic that Scotford decided to take on a partner. By 1907, he was apparently working with Daniel E. Soper, a former Michigan Secretary of State. That didn't mean he was particularly trustworthy, mind you. Soper had, after all, been forced to leave office after being hit with claims of embezzlement. Despite his shady past, Soper became one of the main supporters of Scotford's artifacts, lauding them and boasting of their importance and splendor. But while he apparently denied accusations that he had profited from selling the relics, contemporary evidence suggests otherwise. At around the same time Soper joined the fray, Catholic pastor James Savage got involved. He was utterly convinced of the authenticity of the artifacts enough to purchase some for his private collection. Apparently, he believed that they were left behind by people descended from the lost tribes of Israel. Later, in 1911, a newly published booklet also supported the theory that the Michigan relics were centuries old. But while Scotford and Soper were happily offloading crowns allegedly taken from the graves of ancient kings, dissent was growing behind the scenes. Not everyone, it seems, was taken in by their outlandish stories. As early as 1891, the findings of Emerson and another academic, Professor F.W. Putnam, had been enough to convince one potential group of purchasers to disband. Apparently, the hieroglyphs were bogus, and that wasn't the only problem. On the back of one piece, the same character was represented whole lines at a time, Emerson wrote after examining the relics. There were incumbent lions on some lids of the caskets. Of these, one or two had no tail. I told one of the gentlemen that a primitive artist would never make such an omission. And over time, there was more evidence to suggest the artifacts were not quite what they seemed. One of the biggest red flags? The items made from clay had not been fired. Surely, then, they would have simply turned to mud when subjected to the unforgiving rain of a Michigan winter. At one point, investigators also performed a metallurgical analysis on some of the copper artifacts. And, tellingly, they found that the material was not the unadulterated type used by the region's indigenous people. Instead, it was a commercial, hot-rolled substance made in Michigan when Scotford was in operation. The slate relics, too, came in for some heavy criticism over the years. According to a report, these bore more than a passing similarity to roofing tiles made in a factory near Scotford's home. It was also claimed that the slate could be traced to modern quarries across New England. Apparently, one of the artifacts even seemed to have been touched with modern-day tools. Emerson wrote, "On opening one casket, we found that the lid had been dried on a machine-sawed board." Other observers have noted similar signs of non-ancient origin on a number of the clay and slate relics. But what of the strange inscriptions found on the objects? Were they not evidence of an ancient, mysterious culture once thriving in Michigan? Well, according to 19th-century academics Francis Kelsey and Morris Jastrow Jr., the symbols were fakes too, and poor ones at that. Kelsey and Jastrow considered the inscriptions a linguistic disaster, a BYU Studies quarterly paper states. Several ancient scripts had been jumbled together, they claimed, resulting in a horrible mixture. Furthermore, the inscriber used too few characters at too high a frequency for his work to represent authentic language. There were other hints that the relics were a fraud. In 1893, Scotford tried to convince officials at the Chicago World's Fair to display one of the artifacts, only to have it dismissed as a fake. Reportedly, archaeologist Walter Wyman traveled to Michigan to follow up on the incident, and he was shocked by what he saw there. According to a New York Times report of the period, Scotford was at work in his shed, and so the archaeologist came upon him unexpectedly, surrounded by curious objects in various states of manufacture. "He was not at all embarrassed," Mr. Wyman said the other day, and tried to sell for $100 a stone casket bearing hieroglyphics. "I didn't like to say I knew he was a faker and gave various excuses. But before I left the place, he offered me the casket at the bargain rate of $25. Case closed? Not quite. Some people still believed in the relic's authenticity, and among them were members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, otherwise known as the Mormon Church. To these folks, the artifacts were evidence that the events described in the Book of Mormon had genuinely taken place. One of these supporters, Mormon elder Rudolf Etzenhauser, even produced a booklet featuring images of the Michigan relics. And in 1909, scientist James E. Talmage, himself a member of the same faith, began an investigation into the artifacts. At first, he too was impressed by the links between the objects and the stories told in the Book of Mormon. After a while, though, Talmage began to notice holes in the story promoted by Scotford and Soper. In a 1911 report to Mormon elders, he wrote, "The matter of the Michigan relics is still one of doubt and perplexity. In my mind, the evidence of forgery is very strong. But the absolute proof of forgery, the identification of the forger, and the location of the factory are yet incomplete." Later that year, Talmage also received damning testimony from Scotford's stepdaughter. She apparently confirmed that the artifacts were forgeries, ones intentionally planted to be uncovered during a staged excavation. So was it all just an elaborate scam, designed to generate money for the two scheming men? Or were there some ancient truths hidden within the Michigan relics? Certainly, neither Scotford nor Soper ever admitted that the artifacts were fake. Right up until their deaths, they continued to promote them as the genuine article. And in the years since, the relics have acquired legendary status, particularly within the Mormon Church. Thank you for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe.